Chapter 1. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the small suburban neighborhood. The Williams family had just finished dinner and were settling in for the night. David Williams sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV. His wife, Rachel, was in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes. Their two children, Jake and Samantha, were upstairs in their bedrooms, getting ready for bed. Suddenly, the peaceful silence was interrupted by a loud banging on the front door. David and Rachel exchanged a worried look before David cautiously made his way to the door. As he peered through the peephole, he saw a disheveled man with a wild look in his eyes. The man was covered in dirt and dried blood, and he was mumbling incoherently. David's hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure of what to do. Rachel appeared behind him, her face etched with concern. "Don't open it," she whispered. "It could be one of those things." David knew exactly what she meant. The news had been full of reports of a virus that was turning people into mindless, flesh-eating monsters. They called them zombies. As the man continued to bang on the door, David and Rachel made a split-second decision. They gathered their children and a few essentials, then snuck out the back door and into the darkness of the night. They had no idea where they were going, but they knew they had to get as far away from the undead as possible. The Williams family was about to embark on a journey for survival in a world overrun by zombies. Chapter 2. The Williams family ran through the dark streets, their hearts pounding in their chest. They had no idea where they were going, but they knew they had to get as far away from the undead as possible. "Where are we going, Mom?" Jake asked, panting as he tried to keep up with his parents. "We'll find a safe place, honey," Rachel replied, her voice shaking with fear. "Just keep running." They turned down a side street and found themselves in a residential area. The houses were dark and quiet, and the only sound was the thudding of their footsteps on the pavement. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the shadows. It was another one of those things, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. David grabbed Rachel's hand and pulled her towards the nearest house. They burst through the door and slammed it shut, barricading it with whatever they could find. They huddled in the living room, their breaths coming in short gasps. They had no idea how long they would be safe in this unfamiliar house, but they knew they couldn't stay there forever. As the night dragged on, the Williams family made a plan. They would gather supplies and find a way to get out of the city. They would do whatever it took to survive in this new, dangerous world. The zombie apocalypse had just begun, and the Williams family was determined to make it through. Chapter 3. The Williams family spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, trying to come up with a plan. They knew they couldn't stay in the city for much longer, but they also knew that the roads would be dangerous and heavily populated with zombies. "We need to find a way to get out of here without attracting too much attention," David said, his voice low. Rachel nodded. "Maybe we can find a map and figure out a way to get to the countryside. It's probably safer there." They searched the house and were able to find a map and a few supplies, including some non-perishable food and a first aid kit. They also gathered some weapons for protection, such as a baseball bat and a couple of kitchen knives. As the sun began to rise, the Williams family set out on their journey. They moved cautiously, staying off the main roads and staying as quiet as possible. They encountered a few zombies along the way, but they were able to dispatch them quickly and silently. They knew they couldn't afford to draw too much attention to themselves. After several hours of walking, they finally saw a sign for a small town in the distance. They quickened their pace, their hearts filled with hope. As they approached the town, they saw that it was abandoned and overgrown with weeds. It was clear that no one had been there in a long time. But to the Williams family, it was a safe haven. They knew they could fortify the houses and survive there until they figured out their next move. The zombie apocalypse was a harsh and unforgiving world, but the Williams family was determined to make it through. They had each other, and that was all they needed to survive. Chapter 4. The Williams family spent the next few days fortifying their new home in the abandoned town. They gathered supplies and set up barricades to keep the zombies out. They also spent time exploring the town, trying to find any survivors. They eventually found a small group of people who had been hiding in an old hardware store. The group consisted of a middle-aged couple, a young man, and a teenage girl. They were all relieved to find others who were still alive and willing to help them survive. Together, the group worked to make their new home as safe as possible. They set up a lookout on the roof of the hardware store and took turns standing guard. They also scavenged for supplies and hunted for food. Despite the dangers of the world outside, the Williams family and their new friends found moments of joy and hope in their small community. They played games and told stories, and even managed to laugh from time to time. But they also knew that they couldn't stay in the town forever. They needed to find a way to get to a safer place, where they could rebuild and thrive. One day, they received a message on their radio. It was a faint signal, but they could make out the voice of a man claiming to have a cure for the virus that had caused the zombie apocalypse. The Williams family and their friends knew they had to find this man and his cure. They gathered their supplies and set out on a journey that would take them across the country, facing all kinds of dangers and challenges along the way. They were determined to survive, no matter what it took. The zombie apocalypse had turned their world upside down, but they were determined to fight for a better future. Chapter 5. The Williams family and their friends traveled for weeks, following the faint signal of the man claiming to have a cure for the virus that had caused the zombie apocalypse. They encountered all kinds of dangers along the way, from hordes of zombies to hostile survivors. But they were determined to find the cure and bring it back to their small community. As they neared the location of the signal, they saw a small town in the distance. It was surrounded by a high wall, and they could see people moving around inside. They approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. When they reached the gate, they were greeted by a group of armed guards. "Who are you and what do you want?" one of the guards asked, his hand hovering over his weapon. "We're looking for a man who has a cure for the virus," David said, holding up his hands in surrender. "We heard he was here." The guard looked at them skeptically, but after a moment, he nodded and signaled for them to follow him. The Williams family and their friends were led into the town, which was bustling with activity. They saw people of all ages going about their daily tasks, and they were struck by how normal everything seemed. They were taken to a small clinic, where they were greeted by a man in a lab coat. "I'm Dr. Thompson," the man said, extending his hand. "I've been working on a cure for the virus. I'm glad you found me." The Williams family was overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. They knew they had finally found the help they needed to bring their world back from the brink of destruction. As Dr. Thompson began to explain his research and the progress he had made, the Williams family knew that they had finally found hope for a better future. The zombie apocalypse was far from over, but they were one step closer to survival. Chapter 6. The Williams family listened in horror as Dr. Thompson admitted that he had lied about having a cure for the virus. He had lured them there under false pretenses, hoping to use them as food for his group of cannibals. "Please, don't hurt us," Rachel begged, tears streaming down her face. "We just want to survive and find a way to fix this." But Dr. Thompson was unmoved. He and his group had resorted to cannibalism in order to survive, and they saw the Williams family and their friends as nothing more than a source of food. David knew they had to escape, and fast. He grabbed Rachel's hand and signaled to their friends to follow him. They burst through the door of the clinic and ran as fast as they could through the town. They could hear the cannibals chasing after them, but they didn't look back. They reached the gate and flung it open, not stopping until they were well out of range of the town. They collapsed on the ground, panting and sweating. "We have to find a way to get back to our community," David said, his voice shaking with fear. "We can't let them get their hands on anyone else." The Williams family and their friends nodded in agreement. They knew they had to find a way to protect their loved ones and stop the cannibals from preying on anyone else. As they set out on the long journey back home, they were more determined than ever to survive and find a way to fix the world that had been torn apart by the zombie apocalypse. Chapter 7. The Williams family and their friends traveled for days, trying to find their way back to their small community. They were constantly on the lookout for danger, and they had to be careful not to attract the attention of zombies or other hostile survivors. As they neared their destination, they saw that the town was surrounded by a group of heavily armed men. They were wearing uniforms and had a symbol on their arms that the Williams family didn't recognize. "Who are they?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," David replied, his hand hovering over his weapon. "But we need to be careful." The Williams family and their friends approached the men cautiously, trying to get a better look at them. As they got closer, they saw that the men had a small camp set up on the outskirts of the town. "Who are you and what do you want?" one of the men called out, his weapon trained on the group. "We're just looking for a place to stay," David said, holding up his hands. "We don't mean any harm." The man looked them over skeptically, but after a moment, he lowered his weapon and signaled for them to follow him. The Williams family and their friends were led into the camp, where they saw that the men were part of a larger group of survivors. They had set up a small community and were working to rebuild and protect themselves from the dangers of the outside world. The Williams family was relieved to find other survivors who were willing to help them. They knew they had finally found a place where they could be safe and rebuild their lives. As they settled into their new home, the Williams family knew that the zombie apocalypse was far from over. But with the help of their new friends, they were determined to survive and create a better future for themselves and those around them. Chapter 8. The Williams family had finally found a place where they could feel safe and rebuild their lives. They worked alongside the other survivors in the camp, helping to fortify their defenses and gather supplies. But despite their efforts, they knew that the zombie apocalypse was a constant threat. They were always on the lookout for danger, and they knew that they had to be prepared for the worst. One night, as they were settling in for the night, they heard a loud banging at the gates. They quickly grabbed their weapons and ran to see what was happening. As they reached the gates, they saw a horde of zombies pressing against the barricades. There were too many of them to fight off, and the gates were beginning to give way. "We have to get out of here," David shouted, his voice filled with panic. The Williams family and their friends grabbed their supplies and ran as fast as they could. They could hear the zombies behind them, their moans growing louder as they closed in. As they reached the edge of the camp, Rachel stumbled and fell to the ground. David rushed to help her, but it was too late. A zombie had bitten her, and she was turning into one of them. "I won't turn into one of those things," Rachel sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Please, David. You have to do something." David knew there was only one thing he could do. He grabbed his weapon and, with a heavy heart, ended Rachel's suffering before she could turn into a zombie. The Williams family and their friends fled into the night, their hearts heavy with grief. They knew they had lost a beloved member of their community, and they vowed to do whatever it took to protect the others from the same fate. Write the next chapter in this novel. They meet the cannibals again, and this time they fight, but Williams' family and friends manage to kill all of them. The Williams family and their friends traveled for days, trying to find a safe place to rest and mourn their loss. They knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long, as the zombies and other dangers of the apocalypse were always lurking. As they made their way through the desolate landscape, they heard a faint sound in the distance. It was the sound of laughter and shouting, and it sent a shiver down their spines. Do you think it's them?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking with fear. David nodded grimly. "I think it's the cannibals. We have to be careful." The group approached cautiously, their weapons at the ready. As they got closer, they saw that it was indeed the group of cannibals who had tried to use them as food. The cannibals noticed the group and charged at them, their eyes wild with hunger. The Williams family and their friends fought back with all their might, determined to protect themselves and stop the cannibals from hurting anyone else. The fight was brutal and bloody, but in the end, the Williams family and their friends emerged victorious. They had managed to kill all of the cannibals and protect themselves from their twisted desires. As they stood amidst the bodies of their foes, the Williams family knew they had finally found some measure of justice for their lost loved ones. They vowed to do whatever it took to survive in this harsh and unforgiving world. Chapter 9. The Williams family and their friends were overjoyed and they saw the helicopters landing in the distance. They knew that these were the military, and that they had finally found a way out of the zombie apocalypse. They ran towards the helicopters, their hearts filled with hope. As they got closer, they saw that the military had set up a small camp, with soldiers moving about and tending to the wounded. "We need to get out of here," David shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, can you help us?" The soldiers looked at the group with sympathy and nodded. They knew that the survivors of the zombie apocalypse had been through a lot, and they were determined to help them find safety. The Williams family and their friends were loaded onto the helicopters and flown to a secure location, where they were given food, water, and medical care. As they recovered from their journey, they couldn't believe that they had finally found a way out of the nightmare that had consumed their world. They knew that they would never forget the horrors they had faced and the loved ones they had lost. But they also knew that they had a chance to start over and create a better future for themselves and their fellow survivors. The zombie apocalypse was finally over, and the Williams family was ready to move on and rebuild their lives. The end. Chapter 10. The Williams family had finally found safety and security, or so they thought. They had been living in the military camp for several weeks, recovering from their journey and trying to come to terms with their new reality. But one day, David overheard a conversation between two soldiers that sent a shiver down his spine. They were talking about the experiments the military was conducting on the survivors, trying to find a cure for the virus that had caused the zombie apocalypse. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had trusted the military to help them, and now he was learning that they had been using them as guinea pigs. He knew he had to do something to protect his family and their friends. He gathered them together and whispered his plan. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let them use us like this. We have to find a way to escape." The Williams family and their friends nodded, their faces grim with determination. They knew they had to take action, even if it meant putting themselves in danger. They waited until the cover of darkness, and then made their move. They snuck past the guards and fled into the night, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. But they didn't get far. They were quickly caught by the military and brought back to the camp, where they were locked up and guarded by heavily armed soldiers. The Williams family knew they had to find a way to escape, but they also knew that it wouldn't be easy. They were surrounded by dangers on all sides, and they knew that they had to be careful if they wanted to survive. Chapter 11. The Williams family was desperate to find a way out of their situation. They knew that the military was using them as guinea pigs for their experiments, and they were determined to escape before it was too late. David knew he had to do something drastic to save his family. He approached the leader of the military group and begged him to let his family go in exchange for his own participation in the experiments. But the leader was unmoved. He saw the survivors as nothing more than tools to be used in his quest for a cure. In desperation, David begged and pleaded, but it was no use. The military was determined to use all of them for their experiments, no matter what the cost. As the experiments began, the Williams family held each other close, praying for a miracle. But it wasn't meant to be. One by one, they all fell victim to the virus and turned into zombies. David was the only one who survived. He was injected with a serum that made him immune to the virus and gave him superhuman strength. As he watched his family and friends turn into mindless monsters, David was consumed by rage. He vowed to take revenge on the military and the scientists who had caused so much suffering. He broke out of the camp and went on a rampage, killing all of the military personnel and scientists who had played a part in the experiments. He was a one-man army, fueled by his grief and anger. As the bodies piled up, David knew he had finally found justice for his loved ones. He vowed to use his powers to protect the surviving members of the zombie apocalypse and make sure that no one else had to suffer the way he did. The end. Chapter 12. David roamed the desolate landscape, searching for other survivors of the zombie apocalypse. He knew he had to find a way to use his powers for good, to help those who had suffered like he had. As he walked, he came across a small group of people huddled around a campfire. They looked up as he approached, their faces wary and fearful. "Who are you?" one of them asked, his hand hovering over his weapon. "My name is David," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I was one of the survivors of the military's experiments. They used me and my family as guinea pigs in their quest for a cure." The group looked at him with shock and horror. They knew about the experiments, but they had never heard of anyone surviving them. "We're scientists," one of them said, his voice shaking. "We've been working on a cure for the virus, but we've had no luck so far. Maybe you can help us." David nodded. He knew that he had to use his powers for good, to help those who were still suffering from the virus. He told the scientists about his experience and offered to give them some of his blood so that they could create a cure. The scientists were skeptical at first, but they knew they had to try anything that might help. As they worked together, David couldn't help but feel hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to stop the zombie apocalypse and create a better future for all of the survivors. If you like this video, please give it a like and share. Subscribe the channel for more amazing stories.